Hey folks, welcome to the Contact Center Network. We may not be live, so if you're watching this in re-record, welcome to the show and the episode that we've got for today. And we've got two awesome speakers. We've got Kieran from Stribe, and we've got Joe Garland, who is going to share with us some really awesome stuff around some research that she's done around employee engagement. So today's session is really thinking about how we can use employee engagement strategies that help organizations shift the mood and the pulse and the feelings of their teams. So we do all sorts of stuff to support our teams, and we've got all sorts of different ideas and thoughts when it comes to employee engagement. But Kieran and Joe have got some really proven tips and techniques that are going to help. So before I waffle on too much, I'm going to invite Kieran and Joe to do an intro. We'll start with yourself, Kieran. Give us a little bit of an intro into yourself, Stribe, and how Stribe has come about and what you do within Stribe as a business. So over to you, Kieran.
Thank you so much, Gary. Hi, everybody. I'm Kieran. I am the founder of a business called Stribe and another business called Toot Toot. And what we do is we're on a mission to give everybody a voice. And we do that in two places. We do that in the educational world through a safeguarding app that we have called Toot Toot. And that lets children and young people report bullying anonymously wherever they are in the world directly to someone in their school who can do something about it. And in the workplace world, we have Stribe, which is an employee engagement, employee voice and pulse survey tool for dispersed workforces, whether that's people who work remote or hybrid, or whether that's people in sectors who aren't even desk-based, like construction and manufacturing. And we tie them both together in a bit of social value. So when you give a voice to your staff, we will give a voice to the communities that those staff live and work in by providing Toot Toot for free.
Brilliant. And I love the concept of Toot Toot. I think that's a really valuable support tool for children. And I love how you've pivoted it into voice of the employee as well. I think it's a really valuable offering that you've got. Joe, let's hear from you yourself. Give yourself a nice introduction.
Thank you. Thanks, Gary. Thanks for inviting us on. So pleased to be here. So I've been within working in contact centres, both client side and BPO side for the last 20 years. And recently, the last couple of years, I've been absolutely passionate about employee engagement and carried out some research and wrote a thesis on employee engagement in contact centres, which I'm here to share a bit about today. But just really enthusiastic about the whole world of contact centres and making sure people enjoy coming to work. So thanks for the invite.
You're very welcome. And I think there's some really interesting stuff that we've got on the agenda today to talk about. And I think we always talk about massively in the contact center. Everybody talks about employees and employee engagement and how can we retain more of our teams and what can we do to kind of make people engaged and have fun and feel motivated at work. And I think some of the struggle with that and the dynamic with that has shifted massively over the last 3 or 4 years as we've moved into this remote hybrid different operating models, and now we've come out the other side of it and we're saying, right, actually we want people to come back to work and we want people to be in the office, and I think there's a real power struggle within organizations at the moment where the leadership team are at the behest of the frontline operational team who no longer feel compelled to come into the office. So I think driving some of that shift in engagement is a really interesting topic for us to debate today. So actually, can you have as an engaged workforce remotely as hybrid or as bricks and mortar? So I'll be really interested to kind of understand some of the stuff that came out of your research as well, because I think it makes for a really interesting topic of discussion. And as part of that, Joe, what we've looked at, and one of the things that I wanted to bring into the table today is some of that research that you've done over the last couple of years. So I thought it would be good for you to be able to share some of those findings with the audience that's watching today. And then we can start to interrogate some of that in a little bit more detail. And some of the questions that we've got for both you and Kieran will then start to pull some of that juicy analytics out that you've got. So I will hand over to you to give yourself an intro, and then when you need the slides pulling up, give me a shout and I will pull them up. I'll just remove that one for now. Over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, firstly, I think the human need to feel engaged at work is relevant wherever you are. And that's why it's such a key, important topic. And it was during COVID when many contact centres were mandated to work at home. I carried out some research on employee engagement within that contact centre environment. And the aim of the research was to find out what elements of that employee experience in that environment drive engagement and what elements detract from engagement. And I did that through some qualitative interviews where I interviewed in depth a number of different people from a number of different teams, varying tenures, to get a really good overview of how people felt about their experience at work. And then, as all good research, you have it transcribed, and then we generated codes, and then the theories would come back off those codes. And what I want to share with you today is just talk through the main themes that came out of that research. If we can have the first slide, Gary, that'd be great.
You certainly can. Here's my best COVID impression. First slide, Joe.
Fantastic. So we had 4 key themes that are on the slide there, and within those key themes are broken down into what's called sub-themes. So these are the things that were really, really important for driving engagement. And the majority of them, lack of these things that were these topics, drove disengagement if they weren't there. So if you look at the first one, the role characteristics, the degree of variety and challenge in a role is a key engagement driver or detractor. And everyone I interviewed really spoke about these elements as part of their experience. So the more variety and challenge they had within a role, the more engaged they were, and the more disengaged they were. And that task monotony was a real demotivator. And we know some contact centre roles can be quite monotonous, so this is a real challenge. But it was interesting during that time of COVID. Many of the employees were carrying out jobs and tasks and taking on roles they wouldn't usually do. There was virtual floor walking, virtual training. It was all quite different, and I think that variety, even in that environment during COVID, really raised their engagement levels. And interestingly, from a leadership perspective, the leadership role has a lot of variety, but what I found was the level of challenge in those leadership roles was super important. So if there was too much challenge that resulted in pressure, that could disengage people. So that was quite an important way of looking at that. But I think what the most fascinating thing to come out with the research was leadership and the importance of having, some really capable leadership teams within the contact centres in this environment. So firstly, to provide that support, the pastoral support, the support in enabling people to have a bit of variety and challenge in their role, and also really delegating appropriately so people can have autonomy and then can really make their own decisions. And that was a real engagement driver. And I think what was really just fascinating was what we found was the environment actually led to people making more decisions on their own. They're working at home for the first time for many people, didn't have their manager next to them to be able to run decisions past them. So we're able quite quickly to realise and build that confidence to say, actually, I can make these decisions. It's the right thing to do. So that was great. Team dynamics, the 2 things here that really came out loud and clear was having a sense of belonging within that team, but also perceived equality, so that every team member was dealt with in the same way, and it was really equal. And I think this is really important as we discuss, moving forward, that hybrid working environment where we've got some people at home, some people in the office. How do leaders absolutely create that perceived equality? And I think what I found as well was that the sense of belonging within teams was really brought to life by having the daily interactions with team members and colleagues on a professional level, but also on a personal level, and that really highlighted engagement. And then lastly, to just talk about communication, 3 elements of communication came out here. So the first one, around customers, if you had a negative customer reaction, people were, not as engaged as people who had positive customer reactions. But I think the important distinction here is you could have a negative customer reaction, but if you were able to solve that problem for the customer, your engagement levels would rise. So, having that power to make the decisions and solve an issue and take control of that issue for the customer was really drove engagement. Technology really focused on videos. So, webcams, at the time, not every webcam. And I think particularly for leaders, they had a perception that their team were disengaged if they didn't have their camera on. So, we really fought hard during that time to make sure everybody had that webcam functionality. And then lastly, employee voice. So, it's really, obviously within engagement research, employee voice is a key part of building any kind of engagement strategy. And what we found was having a number of different communication methods where people really felt that they could have their voice, be heard, but also action was taken on the back of what they'd said. That really drove engagement.
Yeah, some really interesting stuff. Do you want me to move on to the next slide, Joe?
Yeah, and then the next slide, very briefly, I put all this together to work out, what were the connections between the themes. And I think the only thing I really want to highlight here is the importance of leadership. This is absolutely critical in that remote environment. So not only do they enable kind of the role characteristics I've spoken about, the leaders will be able to say if your role has a bit of variety or if they give you challenging tasks, but they were also able to promote, really the right environment for the right dynamics. And I know, hopefully we get to talk about some of the kind of cultural stuff later, but this is so important. So for me, the key part of my research that came out was the critical role of the leader in creating, high levels of engagement in contact centres.
Yeah. And I think sometimes that leadership role is underestimated or undervalued in the impact that it can have on people. And I talk a lot is say, right, if you've got a bad leader and they show up, they can impact up to 15, 16 other people in terms of their direct line, that direct report. Yeah, if the leader shows up and rocks up and they're bouncing with bundles of energy and ideas and being open, it really sets the tone for the day. So I think that in a remote world, as well as a bricks and mortar world, can looks very different, but can have a really, really positive impact.
Absolutely. Yes, cool. I couldn't agree more.
Kieran, just whilst you've been soaking all that in, while Joe's been sharing all that research with us, any thoughts and reflections from you, or any similarities that you're seeing from interactions that you're having with your clients around what Joe's just shared?
Yeah, no, it is a fantastic bit of research. It corroborates everything we see across all of our clients. It has to start with leadership, no matter what we do. If the leaderships aren't bought into that journey, then it's just going to fall flat on its face from the outset. So having that is key. And all of those findings, all of those the kind of 4 key drivers, whether they were things that would pull you towards engagement or would take you away from engagement, again, echo exactly what we see with all of our customers, big and small.
So you're right, Joe, is what Kieran's saying.
Thanks, Kieran.
Brilliant. Well, let's dive into some questions that might help bring some of that to life. And I think the first one and the most obvious one, because everybody's got their own definition of it, but I want to kind of think about, and I'm going to come to you first for this one, Kieran, is when we talk about employee engagement, what do we actually mean when we talk about and we use the word employee engagement? Is it all just buzzword bingo, or is there a particular definition that you subscribe to?
Yeah, so I mean, it is. You are right. Everybody has their own nuanced definition of it, kind of influenced by the place they work in or places they've worked in before. I certainly don't think it's buzzword bingo for sure. There's too much research out there that shows that if you have an organization with a highly engaged team, your organization consistently outstrips the competition. And for me, kind of genuine employee engagement it's really just about creating an environment where employees want to work. It's where they feel passionate and enthusiastic about their roles, and that touches on quite a few things, because a lot of things, as Joel's research just showed, affect that enthusiasm and that passion, from communication to leadership to opportunities for growth to recognition to culture. There's so many things that can make your day feel great or make your day feel terrible, and those things compound over time. So it is a topic that encapsulates a broad range of things, but I think the fact that broad range of things can be broken down into bite-sized chunks, like I've just kind of broken down there, the recognition, leadership, communication, opportunities for growth, that should be seen as a bit of an opportunity for organizations, because wherever they are on their employee engagement journey, tackling it in bite-sized chunks is way easier than thinking about this as a massive animal that we need to attack.
And Joe, would you subscribe to that same definition there, or do you think there's anything additional?
Yeah, no, I totally subscribe to that. I mean, during my research, I had to, look up every single definition, and there's over 50 definitions, in academic papers. But I suppose, one of the most important studies, the founding kind of study of employee engagement by Kahn, he talks about there being, just as Kieran has described, he talks about there being like an emotional, a physical, and a cognitive kind of component to engagement. And so, it was a great study, which I read quite a few times. But essentially, what came out of it is around being enthusiastic about your work, which we've said, getting enjoyment from your work, not being bored with what you're doing, but also knowing what your goal is. Kieran mentioned about recognition for your goal, but absolutely knowing what your goal is, but also feeling you're capable of doing it. There's nothing worse, is there, when you've been set a task and you don't know how to do it. So, you've got to really, there's a bit about a stretch target, but also really truly believing you're capable of doing it, even with some upskilling. And that you're doing that in a positive environment. For me, it's essentially it's about when you're engaged, when I'm really engaged, and I think this is maybe true for others, is time just flies. You don't even realize you're doing work. You don't feel like you're at work. And I think that's what comes out in a lot of the academic studies in very different words, but it's when you've got your head down and you are kind of absorbed in what you're doing. Yeah,
I like that, Joe. I think you just to remind the audience of the words you said there. You need to enjoy your work. You need to be enthusiastic about it. You need to have really clear goals and instructions, and you need to have the right capability, knowledge, and support to be able to do it. And I think that drives motivation. I think it drives people's desire to want to do a good job, because they feel invested. But I think it also impacts the trust levels that you see in organizations as well. And I think in order for organizations to truly engage with their teams, and for teams to feel engaged, we need to have the right levels of trust and I suppose psychological safety within the organization. I think that's a fundamental component to engagement levels, the feeling of being able to trust my manager, trust my leader, and be able to voice my concerns if I've got one, without fear of reprisal. So I'm going to come to you with this question, Kieran, and ask you really, what does the role of perhaps psychological safety and trust play in creating engaged teams in some of the findings that you've found with your customers and your research?
Yeah, it plays a huge role. It's certainly across all of our customers. It's probably the biggest role alongside leadership. And you touched on the word trust there. That really is the important part. If people don't feel like they can speak up, they just won't. And that's bad for your organization. And vice versa. If they feel like they can speak up, that's great for your organization. Because if they feel safe, they're going to be more likely to share ideas. They're going to provide honest feedback. They're going to voice concerns, all without that kind of fear or retaliation. And if we lose that in organizations, or if we don't have that in organizations to begin with, it'll limit things like innovation, because they're not going to feel like they can take risks or experiment, because there's going to be that fear of reprisal. What if I try this thing and it doesn't go well? And from an opportunity cost point of view, the business wants you to try that thing and wants it to go well, because if it does go well, that's great for the business. But if you don't have that psychological safety, you're never going to take that risk in the first place. It also massively improves collaboration, because if you're in that trusting environment, then you're going to have confidence that you can rely on your colleagues, on your managers, and kind of support each other through whatever you're going through, whether that's stress, whether that's workload, whether that's challenging days and weeks. And it's easy to see that kind of when colleagues have all of those things, it will increase overall job satisfaction and therefore engagement within your organization. So yeah, extremely, extremely important across all the orgs that we've ever worked with.
And thinking about the role of leadership in building that psychological safety and trust, Joe, how important is it that leaders understand those principles and embody them in a particular way? And how do we do that if that's possible, which I'm sure it is?
Yeah, I think it's super important. I mean, to have leaders need to role model that that environment that you want to create with psychological safety. So, being vulnerable, admitting your mistakes, sharing openly and honestly with your teams. And as Kieran said, that you don't want to stifle innovation and creativity. And also, if you've got that environment and leaders are creating, and you've got communication methods that really pull in that all of the ideas and that honest feedback, not only do you understand how employees are feeling, so you can make the right decisions about what you're doing with your employee proposition, you also enable the organization to learn, because you think of all of the knowledge and all of the information frontline employees have got within contact centers. They're listening to the customers, they're experiencing it day in, day out. Why would you not want to kind of have an environment where people are suggesting things that make the organization better? So it's absolutely imperative to have that psychological safe environment to be able to do that. And you can only do that with high levels of trust, trusting with teams, inter-team, and trust between managers and the people in their teams, to just ensure that the right environment is set, and the right opportunities are being presented, and therefore the right decisions get made. So I'm a great believer in the benefit of diversity of thought. There wasn't a great idea that came from one person. There's a great idea that comes from a number of different people in a number of different roles with experiences, and just having that different perspective on things, does help with, better decision making. So yeah, I just think it's imperative, Gary.
Yeah, and I love the phrase you used there, that diversity of thought. I think there's lots of pearls coming out of this one. So I think when you talk about that, and when you talk about how teams work together, and you talked about it, Kieran, in terms of if you've got that diversity of thought and you're creating that environment where you can innovate and collaborate, I think you start to get a really juicy dynamic happening between teams and interdepartmental teams, and then across the wider organization. So it has a snowball effect a little bit. Joe, thinking about your research, and thinking about what actually makes an engaged employee, what were some of the indications from your research to I suppose to say that people were engaged, and what do you think operational leaders should consider when trying to build up that level of engagement within the team?
Okay, so my research was really focused on how people felt during their experiences. So I asked them to explain, think of a time when you were used all these descriptive words, excited, enthusiastic, and I think the real indications came back was they were absolutely absorbed in their work. They weren't bored, they weren't waiting for their tea break, their lunch break. Enthusiasm we spoke about their role, but also they had energy to invest. So they were energetic in their role, so you didn't feel like a dread, and those were kind of the indications and some of the words that came out. And I spoke about that a little while ago about enjoying something so much you lose track of time. But, you know, from the findings, I think there are a number of things that kind of operational managers could consider to, you know, ensure that, you know, they're trying to build engaged teams. So there's a real thing for me around making sure that employees are getting the right amount of support, but also they have a right level of autonomy. So knowing where to, you know, support and help them with tasks, but also know where to delegate. You know, I don't know whether you've ever been in the meetings where most of the people in the meeting don't know the detail because they're the most senior person. They come along and have to be briefed before they go. You know, I'm a great believer in putting people in meetings that actually understand the detail. You know, really taking away you know, the hierarchical thing and thinking actually by giving autonomy to make decisions and present you know, present their knowledge, you really drive that engagement. And you know, linked to that, I think, you know, it'd be really great if leaders could challenge the processes that don't support that. So, you know, challenge the meetings that are just senior people in the meeting. Why can't somebody come who's got the knowledge? Challenge the leaders that don't support that way of working. And also, you know, think about the communication processes you've got within the contact center. So, you know, have you got a number of different communication processes? Are they varied? Are they comprehensive? You know, really taking into account that people have different learning styles. You know, they interact with information differently. So how can you really look at communication as a, you know, essential part of your engagement strategy?
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting points to pull out there. And I think I've just kind of pulled out some of the ones in terms of that right level of support, right level of autonomy, and balancing that out by understanding your people's strengths. I think that's another key part, is saying, right, who is strong within the team and how do we tap into some of those strengths. And then you touched on challenging the process and actually giving people a voice to be able to challenge upwards. And it goes back to that point that we talked about, Kieran, around creating psychological safety and trust so that people feel that they can voice their challenges and their concerns, and action will be taken, I think, is the other important part to play with that. Leading on to how we capture feedback, Kieran, and the role that employees play in feedback. What role, in your view, to create really highly engaged teams, what role does employee feedback and communication play in the engagement strategy, and how do we ensure that feedback is effectively integrated into operations, Kieran?
Yeah. So, I mean, feedback and comms in general, they're just really, really crucial elements to any engagement strategy. And from what we've seen, it's important that it has to be a two-way thing. It can't just be get the feedback from employees and that's it. It's went into a black box somewhere, and we'll you know, something will maybe, hopefully, fingers crossed, be done about it in the future. And also it's important that it's effective, and doing that involves a few things. Firstly, it involves regular and varied feedback channels. There is no panacea here. There's no one silver bullet that says this is the best way to get employee feedback. It's going to come from a wide range of different places because people have less friction in some places than in others in their role. People have different levels of comfort in speaking up in different channels. So whether that's your one-on-ones, whether that's anonymous surveys that kind of follow colleagues through their journey with you, whether that's team meetings, whether that's anonymous employee voice channels, whether that's employee steering groups, all of these kind of different avenues and channels work together to effectively give a voice to colleagues wherever they want to be engaged. And importantly, the thing we see there is giving them a place to be engaged where it reduces friction. You know, you want to reduce friction as much as possible. Secondly, is taking that feedback and being able to demonstrate that it's, first of all, that it's valued before we even tell them what's happening about it. You know, we've got to acknowledge the feedback that we've received, and that we're taking action to address them issues or to implement them suggestions. Because if we don't do this, it'll all fall down. People will just think, what's the point? There's no point bringing up something in that one-to-one. There's no point using that survey because nothing ever gets done about it. Yeah. And then thirdly, and probably the most important of all three, once we've got that feedback, is actually communicating back effectively what change has been taken, what changes are being taken, what actions are being taken, and just as important, what actions aren't being taken as well, and why aren't they taken? Because treating colleagues like adults and kind of taking them on that journey with you, will help drive engagement, because you're giving them extra context about why something might not be able to be done very quickly or very effectively within that organization. And that context, we've always felt, is massively important, because the one thing that is constant in our worlds is that things will change. And if colleagues have context behind why we've made certain decisions, they themselves are going to make better autonomous decisions when things change. And if they don't have that context, they're going to make worse decisions.
Yeah, and it links back into that right support, right level of autonomy, Joe. So I think it really feeds in nicely to say, if we have that parent relationship rather than parent-child relationship, people will start elevating their own thinking, I think. And I think you'll start to get a different degree of agent thinking through problems, rather than that whole, oh, I've got a problem, I'm going to go and speak to my manager, or I'm going to hand it off to my manager, and things like that. So I think when we start to think about, and you touched on this in your slides, Joe, you talked about belonging and a sense of community. And I think in the conversations that I'm having with contact centers that I'm speaking to on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, the operating environment and the structure that you're in, vast majority of them at the moment are hybrid. There's very few that I'm seeing that are in bricks and mortar. There's the odd one or two, and that's usually driven by technology restrictions. But vast majority of them are either remote or hybrid. And leaders say that they're struggling to engage with the teams, and they're struggling to connect with the teams because they're in a remote environment, or because they're all not together. So what I want to debate on this question is, how can contact centers create that sense of community and belonging among employees, especially when they're in remote and hybrid work environments? And Joe, I'm going to come to you first on this one, and then Kieran, I'd love to get your input as well. So Joe, what are the practical things that operational leaders need to do to get this right, do you think? And what are your observations so far?
Yeah, okay, so there's a few things. I think, a real practical thing is, when we've got my observations, I think the challenges come, the biggest challenge comes when you've got a really important meeting, collaborative meeting, and you've got a room full of people in the office and 2 or 3 people at home. That, I think, that is quite challenging, because with the best will in the world, you will have conversations going on in the room, and that's quite hard. So I think for those important meetings, I think it's really, need to have everyone in the room, or perhaps everybody at home, or try to think of a way around that, because I think that does create some kind of, not a sense of belonging, the opposite of a sense of belonging, inequality. Yeah. But I've seen some great things, I think, that build that sense of belonging. And one of those things is having a shared purpose. So, those daily check-in calls, are we aligned on goals? Do we know what each other is doing today? So wherever you are, it's that daily goal, but also making sure there's that golden thread coming through from that wider strategic objective, so everyone knows what the purpose of their role is, making it really relevant. And also things that build connections. So checking in at the start of a meeting, with a word about how you're feeling today, building those personal connections that, rather than going straight into the meeting, this is what we're doing. And I think, a final reflection is that all the things that, organisations do, and you read a lot on LinkedIn, Pizza Fridays and free gifts, and they're all great if they are linked to, building connections. So Pizza Fridays are all very, great if everybody's in the office doing that, and it's not a tick box exercise. But it should all be about, for me, having a shared purpose, and recognising as well that everybody has an individual preference about where they want to work. It's not a one size fits all. It's just making sure that everybody is connected by the purpose, and people have chance to make those personal connections as well as the professional connections on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think you raised some really good points there. I've got one more that I want to add, but I want to get Kieran's input into this before I jump on this one. So Kieran, what do you think contact center professionals and organizations who are in that kind of flux state need to do to actually help them build that sense of belonging and community?
Yeah, it is a great question, and Joe's touched on a lot of amazing points there. We've worked with teams of all shapes and sizes, and dispersed teams especially have their own very unique set of challenges, simply because they're just not in the same room at the same time. But that doesn't mean that it's insurmountable, and Joe touched on a few of them. There's tons of ways we've seen that organisations foster that sense of community and belonging, and they do fall into them two camps that Joe mentioned, the shared purpose camp and the personal connection camp. But on the shared purpose side of things, where we've seen things work very well are being great at recognitions. So, and that's not importantly, that's not just highlighting good work. You know, some people don't have, say, targets in their roles, and so it can be hard to actually quantify did they do a good job. But more, it's around celebrating behaviors that we want people to be living and breathing in our organization. Because when we do that effectively and very, very well, and we do it visibly for the whole organization, whether that's online or whether that's kind of in an all hands or something, or a combo of places, the staff newsletter, etc., then that removes a bit of us v them. It removes a bit of disenfranchisement. It brings people closer together. It shows kind of where people are fitting in the wider org, you know, beyond your role on that desk in that cubicle type of thing. And then on the personal connection side of things, we've seen tons of great ideas. We've had things with kind of hybrid and remote workforces. We ourselves are a fully remote organization, and you do things like, you know, share your pet on the screen type of thing. Like, let's literally have that personal connection where we get to meet you and your dog or you and your cat. For me, it's Princess Delilah at home that I get to show off, and that sort of thing. It really starts to kind of humanize the colleagues who you don't get to see on a day-to-day basis, and like Joe said, when you're checking in with them at the beginning of the meeting, it makes that even more natural as well, because it's not a disingenuous, you know, how are you? It is kind of, it's connected to, you know, how's Delilah getting on? Is she all right? How's she doing in the heat type of thing? And having that kind of personal connection with colleagues, it is tough to foster remotely. But you can do it. Like I said, the pet thing's a great one. We've seen things like shared Spotify playlists. A little bit harder to do the contact center because obviously you've got to be on the call.
Nobody wants my playlist.
But we've seen it with like different moods, and people set up playlists for different moods. You know, when you've got to have deep work, there's a playlist for that. When you've got to have kind of hyped up work, we've got to get through a load of stuff, and we've only got a bit of time to do it. There's a playlist for that as well. And having people collaborate on that can be funny as well, because like you say, exactly what you've just said there, no one wants my playlist. There's a discussion happens around, why the hell is Gary coming here putting Spandau Ballet on Spotify? What's that about?
I love what you said there about and there's been some really great phrases and one-liners in this one today. So I love the phrase you use about humanizing your colleagues. But I think you actually have to consciously do that, because everybody thinks that they know the teams and they know people, but actually in a remote environment or a hybrid environment, you really have to over-index on that humanization of your team. And I remember a session that I ran during COVID. Actually, it was with Mark Walton, who was the CEO of Sensei at the time, and he was talking about, if you think you're communicating enough, then you're not communicating enough. So it's communicate, and it's overcompensate with communication until people tell you essentially that's enough. Don't underestimate the value of that communication and that human approach. But the phrase that I'm hearing a lot, and I've coined my own off the back of it, is BAMB, which is bricks and mortar bias. And I think that's coming out loud and clear in organizations where they are all together. They feel like there is actually more of a connection and more of a sense of belonging than those people that are at home. They feel on the fringe and on the periphery. If there was one thing you could think that might help reduce that or dilute that, Joe, to kind of remove some of that bias, and what would you say maybe is kind of maybe the game changer to help with that?
Oh, well, I think if I had the answer to that, Gary, I'd be I'd be hosting the podcast. I think I mean there's no silver bullet with that. I think it's a tough one, and I think, you know, when like during my research, you know, somebody said actually they felt like they were on a level playing field because everybody was at home. And you know, they felt that everybody was the same. So you know, for me it would be about, because I'm in a remote role at the moment, it would be about trying to get some face-to-face time, so you've built those relationships, so then you've got those personal connections with people, and then you are remote, aren't you? But that is, for me, that's a personal preference. You know, I like that, you know, face-to-face interaction. So you know, it's a tough question, because I don't think there is a silver bullet, and people have got a number of different preferences about how you build that. But it's just any opportunity to build that personal connection will enable you to work, you know, in any way that, you know, or in all the different locations with your team. But it's a tough one. I don't think I don't think anybody's really cracked it yet.
And you know, I've seen that in certain circumstances where there's a part-time, full-time bias, where people say, oh, actually, because I'm part-time, I'm getting overlooked for full-time opportunities or other opportunities. I think now we're in this different environment, that bias has been amplified by your location. And I think it doesn't help when you've got like the CEO of L'Oreal or whoever it was saying, actually, people who are working from home are generally a bit more lazier. I think those generalizations and those sweeps really impact that. Are you seeing a bricks and mortar bias in any of the feedback that's coming through into Stripe, Kieran?
Yeah, no, for sure there is. And I think a key part of why it happens is it's a slightly different way of communicating effectively with people who aren't in the office face to face. Because when we're in the office, it's a very synchronous communication. We can talk over the desk, we can get the answer to what we want right now. Whereas when we start involving colleagues who are hybrid, it brings asynchronicity into our world. And that can be jarring for people that haven't been used to it. It can be jarring because you're not getting the answer straight away. It can be jarring because you don't know what's going on. But that also, I think, when you're cognizant of that it is a different way of communicating, it means that you can start to plan the working environment around that asynchronicity. And that's something we've had to learn at Stripe. You know, how can we effectively project manage? How can we effectively give out tasks and collaborate with colleagues when then colleagues might not be in the same room together? And so for us, there's tools out there that we've used that have helped that, whether it's kind of canvases that we can kind of draw on collaboratively, or whether it's Slack channels and we document what's happened in meetings, and we're very open with kind of the minutes of every meeting gets put into Slack, so that all of our colleagues can read their minutes as well at their leisure. They don't have to have been in that meeting if they are remote, but they can see the key actions. Sending things out ahead of time as well, so people get a chance to read all of that. It's just, I guess, being cognizant of the fact that there is that asynchronicity there. And I think that is what does drive a lot of that bias, because I think given a choice, most people would want the thing now. And so they lean towards synchronicity. They lean towards, I'll just go to the desk and tap on the shoulder and say, can you help me with A, B, and C?
Yeah. And you know what? I think it's the small things, I think, that drive some of that bias, because I've seen it where, especially if they're in a different setup and people are working on different days and they're doing the office different days, and all of a sudden you have, like you mentioned earlier, Joe, Pizza Fridays. Oh, but I work from home on Pizza Fridays, or I'm not in the office today. So there is a real risk that we alienate people who are out of the office and aren't part of that. And I think it really needs to be thought through, doesn't it? So I mean, you've got that stuff that you can do reactively, and you can say, right, sun's out today, we'll get the ice cream truck round. Brilliant. You've got to think about the impacts on the wider organization and all those people that aren't in the office that day, who aren't getting an ice cream from the truck because it's outside, or aren't getting a pizza from the office. So I think it's thinking about, right, actually, we're going to do that. Here's a voucher for a suitable pizzeria of your choice. Go and grab yourself a pizza. We're having lunch tomorrow. So I think it's that thought through, and it's that communication piece that is the key. And I mean, sometimes you can't please everybody. If you're having some of those reactive days, it's the luck of the draw, isn't it, sometimes? But it's being mindful of that bias and how your actions can be perceived by those that aren't on site or aren't there, because that will drive disengagement.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just thinking of some of the other things that drive engagement, and I think we've talked about incentives, we've talked about communication, we've talked about ways of working, but I think the actual workload of people sometimes drives disengagement, and that feeling that I'm being overwhelmed or that feeling of burnout can play a major part in driving disengagement within the contact center. So how do we, Joe, and I'll start with you on this one, Joe. If I could ask you, how do we address the issues of burnout and stress amongst the contact center industry? Because it's getting harder, the job is getting harder, it's getting more complex. But how do we address those issues to maintain a more positive and engaging work environment?
Yeah, and I think this is a super interesting question, because I think when you consider the top causes of workplace stress, they're all very prevalent within a contact center. And so if you think about, some of them one of them, for example, is control. So not being able to control how you do your work. And if you think of a frontline agent, they're told when to go to tea, they're told, your work stat, you're measured on KPIs, that lack of control can really cause an amount of stress. So I think, it's not easy, is it? It wouldn't be easy. We've all worked in or got familiar with planning teams. It's a mammoth task trying to plan your resource effectively. But we need to think of ways where we can give frontline agents some real autonomy and give them back control. If it's not within their day-to-day role, what else can we do? So those are the types of things I'll be thinking about. And another thing is support. So absolutely prioritizing your one-to-ones. Those are always the things under times of lots of priorities coming at you. Those are the things that drop off. So the one-to-ones, the development chats, and that may be one of the only places that employee can give their views and feel heard. So for me, it's around looking for opportunities, going back to my research to really think about how can you give somebody more control over what they're doing, more variety. How can you ensure that you prioritize as a leader in the contact center your one-to-ones, your development chats, and those things don't fall by the wayside. And we spoke about communication a lot. That couldn't be more important. So does everybody understand their roles and responsibilities? Do they understand their purpose? So it's like over communicating all of the time, so they're not filling in the gaps. But yeah, I mean, it's a big, burnout and stress is quite common, I think, amongst contact center employees. And then with the it's more socially acceptable now to really flag these issues. I think this is becoming something that organizations absolutely need to focus on.
Definitely. And Kieran, I suppose from some of the voice of the employee feedback that you get, is stress, is burnout, is that coming from the employee population as still a significant issue? Is that some of the stuff that you're hearing?
It definitely is. Everyday colleagues are asked to do more and more with the same amount of time, and that just compounds onto their day, especially in a contact center as well. It's a very high pressure environment. Like Joe said, you're targeted. You've got these KPIs you've got to hit. It can be a bit overwhelming at times. I think in order to try and combat effectively the stress and the burnout, we've got to look to implement great wellness programs alongside things like our EAP, and try and promote a culture. And a lot of this comes from leadership. Promote a culture where colleagues can feel like they can actually use them wellness programs without any stigmatization. Yes, you're taking a kind of a couple hours off work because you've implemented some sort of flexi work, not making a joke about it. Don't make them feel bad about
part-timer.
Utilizing. Yeah, part-timer, exactly. And it is a joke, it is a laugh, but it does really affect people. And if we can show that leaders are taking advantage of that, and they're clocking off a bit earlier because they're using some of that flexibility that we're affording them, and having them encourage that of their team as well, that'll go a long way. And also being able to freely speak up about it. And again, that comes from leadership as well, trying to remove that stigmatization about speaking about stress. We don't want people to bottle it up. A kind of a problem shared is a problem halved, is what they say, and it very much is that on the stress side of things, and that has to come through in everything we do. Whether it's our one-to-ones, we need to talk about it. There needs to be an agenda item on it. How are you feeling? How's the workload? Are you stressed? Are you managing it okay? Is there anything we can do to support that? Is there anything you need from us to help support that? But also in all of the other things we do as well, whether that's the team meetings, whether that's the get-togethers that we have, even on the Pizza Fridays, etc. Anything we can do as leaders to show people that we do care. We genuinely want people to come into work and not dread it on a Monday, because all they're going to do is worry all weekend. They get to Friday and they have that reprieve, but then the next thing they're thinking of is the dread of Monday morning and coming back into that same environment. We've got a bit of a tagline on our website, which is, we want to make every Monday feel like Friday. Everybody looks forward to going home on a Friday. And if we can kind of live and breathe that in our own workplaces, that's going to be a great thing for our employees.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think it's about that role modeling piece, isn't it? And I think as leaders, we accept that we've got to do more hours. We're going to work through our breaks. We're probably not going to take a lunch, and if we do, we'll probably eat at our desks, and we'll just do it whilst we switch the camera off the screen and just munch on a sandwich. So I think it's those role modeling of behaviors that and giving ourselves that kind of stiff talking to, that then means the team kind of look to that as a way of working. And I was in a session with a leader who's like, I don't tell my team they can't take breaks, but he never takes a break. So it's like, what message are you sending to your team if you're never taking any breaks and you're saying on all hours that the world sends? It creates, we role model and we set those behaviors and we set those routines. So I think that's been a really interesting discussion. I'm going to ask you to succinctly, if there's one thing that you'd like somebody to take away from today's session that's going to help them drive engagement in their employee base. I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here. I appreciate that. That's why I'm filling in a second. But if there was one thing that you'd want somebody to take away from this to help drive higher levels of employee engagement, Joe, what would that be? And then Kieran, I'll come to you, and then we'll close it for today.
So for me, it's the criticality of leadership. So in a contact center, it's the capability, the critical nature of the team leader. Are they providing the support and giving the opportunities to drive engagement?
Wonderful. And Kieran, if there was one thing that you'd want people to go away and do differently from this session?
I'm going to cheat a little bit because I'm going to have an and in my sentence, which makes it two. But I'm going to say humanize your colleagues and involve them in that journey as well. You won't have all of the answers, but speaking to your employees, you will get the answers from there, and you'll be able to choose what works for you and your organization and take colleagues on that journey driven by them.
Yeah, fantastic ideas and fantastic solutions. So that is the end of today's session. I just want to thank Kieran and Joe for bearing with me through some of the technical challenges that we had on today's session, which nobody needs to know about. But it's been a really, really interesting debate and discussion. And I've written tons of notes here that I'll share in an article, and I'll be sharing this video through YouTube as well, and publishing it to LinkedIn. So if you're watching in the replay, hello and goodbye. That's the final session before we break for July and August, and we'll be back for, would you believe it, the autumn schedule in September. So we're in the autumn schedule in September, where we're discussing performance management practices and coaching practices in contact centers. And I've got Helen Bowman-Manahan joining me, and I've got Nathan Dring joining me, who are both contact center extraordinaires, and will help me tackle that discussion. But thank you very much, Kieran. Thank you very much, Joe. Enjoy your summers, and I will speak to you all another time, and I'll end the recording here.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, everyone.